This is not going to be a 6-hour podcast.
This is not an Arby's.
Episode 99, Console Crusade. EJ Olson, Nick Durheim, Chris, Billy Four. Last week we decided we're going to do podcasts every week to just chat about The Last of Us. That's what we're doing, and what a doozy. I went into this and I told Sarah, like, here's what to expect based on the game, which the show has been pretty faithful to so far. And I gave her the backstory on Bill, and, well, anyway, that is not what I expected, and it was something. So I know, Chris, you were antsy to chat about this. I think you said to me in a text that was 10 out of 10 without flaw.
Yeah, I mean, it's like frame perfect to me, honest to God, that we basically got like a short film about Bill and Frank. And when they announced like, oh, this dude's going to play Frank, I was sort of like, what? Like the guy we literally never see that he's like mentioned in the game, but is not a character. So I was like, okay, cool. So we'll get like a little bit of backstory and that'll be really neat. You know, maybe one of these like cold open type things that they'd been doing with the interviewer and then with the Indonesia, the section in Jakarta. Nope. They took a hard left turn at Albuquerque.
So in the game, Joel needs a car battery, right? So that's the same. And then he knows this guy, Bill, but he's never been to his compound. So they go, he gets caught in one of Bill's booby traps. And then they go on this little mini quest to like find a battery that in the game, you gather that Frank and Bill had a falling out and like Frank had stolen the car battery. So that's what kind of sets up that chapter of like running around trying to find the battery. Bill saves Joel. They find that Frank had killed himself because he had been bitten. And so it was subtly tragic. Sort of read between the lines. You find a note from Frank. It's not quite on the nose. The show just was like, yeah, like you said, we're just going to give you the whole fucking story. Yeah, in a vacuum was just, wow. I guess this was a bottle episode 3, more or less.
Yeah, it totally was. Like, I could see maybe some people being a little bit antsy about, okay, well, we just wasted an entire episode. But at the same time, it also is just another vignette summation of like the whole thesis of The Last of Us. So I found that to be very satisfying and totally as a solo experience was awesome and still actually developed Joel's character and pre-established Joel and Tess's relationship as partners in an apocalypse. But yeah, it was a really good, I mean, everyone memes about subversion of expectations and what that means as a creator, but this was a good subversion of expectations where it added and changed, but it didn't detract from any of the characters represented in the original piece of media.
Let's talk about it in a vacuum on its own. I think it can be evaluated pretty differently than maybe not the same way as sort of the bigger picture, but we also don't have the full picture yet, so it's kind of hard to judge it as a piece of television. It's only episode 3 of 12, but just as a standalone story, and like you said, the sort of this little vignette, which if that's the direction they go and we get another 1 or 2 of those, like I would be pretty happy with that actually. Like,
yeah, that would rule. I think they're going to do something very similar with Left Behind, the DLC.
Right. So obviously all of the media leading up to this was cut in a way that you thought we were getting, like we knew we were going to get like a little bit of the backstory, but it was kind of cut to make it seem like, okay, we're going to get what we expect from the game.
Exactly. With the only really like principal shots being Bill aiming the gun into the hole and there being a hole, which you just assume that's going to be either Joel and Ellie or just Joel, like their meeting in the first place, but it was completely different.
Nick Offerman, who I've never seen do anything remotely dramatic. He was, wow. Chris, what do you think about Nick Offerman?
I mean, he annihilated me. I mean, I was like, I was absolutely like full on ugly cry, like keening through the last like 10% of that whole story. I mean, there's so much that, you know, I work with my acting students about like, okay, how do you move yourself into circumstances that aren't your own? And that first scene where Frank is in the house and he's kind of trying to figure out like what to do with that, like that there's this person here and him like trying to bring the food out and the setting of things down, and he'd like the gun, and do I take up the gun? And it'd be one thing to play like, I haven't seen a person in 4 years, which is like like a monumental order to begin with. And it'd be another thing to play that he's been like a long closeted middle-aged gay man in an era where somebody pointed out online that, the outbreak was in 2003 and gay marriage wasn't legalized until 2004. So he literally lived his entire life in civilization, not being able to have someone who he could be married to as a life partner.
Consider where he lives and presumably where he was raised. He's this doomsday prepper.
Don't tread on me flag.
Exactly.
And it'd be one thing to play like all those things individually, but it was just like a perfect cocktail of all of them. Like he never let one be any more critical than the others, which is exactly like, that's what a human is we're just this sum of our experiences. And I just thought he fucking nailed it. I thought the episode was funny. Like I found myself laughing a lot of times, which I think was like pretty clearly intended. It was poignant. The beats of discovery, especially like late in the episode after we've, met these guys, the fact that they totally stole this from Pig. And I'm glad they stole it because it's fucking effective of like cooking the exact meal with the exact wine and the exact placement of the dishes. The only thing that's different about the meal is that he's sitting next to him now instead of sitting across from the table. That fucking killed me.
Even the small flourishes of him twisting the plate to be lined up the way he wants to, and then Frank twisting it back to the way he wanted it differently. Like, it's a total like setup and payoff throughout the entire episode with like 5, I think, time periods and just perfect vignettes. And playing with expectations, like having Bill comment that he's like getting old and Frank saying he likes how he's aging. And then to cut from that scene to the fake out of Bill dying, but it's not, it's not like they don't hold it over you. It's not like hey, we're going to fake you out. It's just like some shit is going down and like, do you care about this character? Because you're being shown that this character, Frank, cares about Bill and is going to take care of him. And yeah, every scene is just perfect between them in the entire length of the episode.
I appreciate that, the episode opens on Joel in the river and he and Ellie are taking a break and they're about to go on this hike. So we do spend time with our main characters. In this episode, despite really being about, characters that our main characters will never meet, it started world building from the very beginning and used that world building to get us into that little vignette. But it kept building the world. So even though it was this bottle episode about characters who really are inconsequential, you didn't need to know anything about what happened to Bill and Frank for Joel to get his battery so he and Ellie can resume their journey. But it served two functions that were really important. One, like I said, it was the world building. We were always learning a little bit more about what all of these characters are going through. And also, it was this reprieve from a very intense episode 2. In the game, this is just like balls to the wall action, right? Like you get caught in the trap. This is the first time you meet a bloater who's like hurling spore bombs at you and shit. Like it's very intense. This show can't just be set piece after set piece after set piece. Like you have to have these moments as a viewer or you're just going to burn out. And so to choose to take these characters and this part of the story and say like, if we just remove that chapter from the game, the end goal being Joel needs a car, if that remains the same, how does that affect like, the arithmetic? And it doesn't change the story, So to take that out and do something completely different with it and give us a look at these characters. I tweeted last night, I said the us in The Last of Us doing some heavy lifting in this episode. And it's an interesting choice if they continue to do it. If this is the only episode we get like this, I think I maybe will be a little more bothered that it was just the one-off. Like, give me at least one more episode like this about a character who we aren't with the entire time. And I know, Nick, you said we're going to get the Left Behind stuff, which was a great little DLC about, Ellie and how she came to be with the Fireflies and whatever. But yeah, I want at least another episode like this. And I think there's an argument to be made that like maybe that wasn't the wisest choice to like leave our characters for that long. And I do personally sort of wish we could have seen Ellie and Bill with the banter, especially because Nick Offerman has the comedic chops, and he showed them here very restrained.
The government aren't all Nazis.
But they weren't before.
You mentioning at the beginning of the episode, it starting with Joel and Ellie, and I found that to be a very interesting way to start that off because Joel presumes that Ellie is going to apologize, but Ellie just turns it around on him and says, I won't be sorry for something that isn't my fault. And starting the episode like that and then moving on to basically an entire episode of Bill and Frank. And the story of this episode is about, Frank says multiple times, this is how I love. I want you to love me the way I want you to love me. And that is just like the strongest foreshadowing in the world about so much of the story in The Last of Us.
Oh my God.
And the inevitable choice that gets made. I just thought that was a really strong sort of thesis statement and reflection upon the themes. And even if it is not progressing the plot in a lot of ways, the plot isn't important unless you have the characters to drive it. Having that sort of reflection, having the flashback scene of Joel and Bill at the dinner table, outside having this like really awkward little lunch, and then Tess and Frank are, hanging out and having a great old time. And even the tiny world building of like them establishing, it's really like sort of stupid that they would do it this way, but like them actually, telling us that this is the establishment of their code of like playing 80s music if there's trouble. And that gets brought up in the first episode with Tommy, like listening to the radio and hearing 80s music and knowing that Tommy's in trouble.
It's interesting that you say that because I don't think that's Tommy. I think that is Frank and Bill. And I think that's what got me again after I had done, I was done like, keening on the couch with Tiffany after the end of the, art film, Bill and Frank's Excellent Adventure. Yeah, they get into the basement and the 80s music is still playing. And Ellie's like, why didn't he shut the music off? And Joel says something to the effect of, oh, he must have never come back to like shut it off, basically, which to me said Bill turned it on before he cooked the dinner, that he was like letting them know, like, we're going to die. Like, that is the trouble, is that we're going to die together. And I was like, holy shit.
Do you guys remember what month Joel and Ellie are in right now? Have they established that? And I just have forgotten. Early to middle fall, right?
Yeah, we're still in fall.
And they had died at the end of August. It was like the 29th.
The letter's dated 29 August.
The offhand comment that Joel said was like, set a timer, like if nothing, it's like a lost scenario. Like if nobody does anything for a set amount of time, then it just automatically would start playing the code music. So I think it was like a 2-week period or something where if nothing is done, then something is amiss. And
I didn't track the specifics quite that far, which is some good sleuthing on your part, but it's just enough for me to go like, oh shit, like that's what that was. It was a great like foreboding sort of thing of the radio like clicking on, and then a good moment of Ellie, doing some sleuthing of her own. We're like, okay, this kid's like clearly capable, but then to come back and have it be this thing that is like so devastating also.
Yeah, nice Chekhov's gun at the end there too.
Literally.
I can't not talk about it anymore. Like they did so many things in this episode that are so true to so many different parts of the game, like some in like really obvious ways and some in ways that like I didn't really think about until later. But little things like Ellie knifing the infected, like when she was like had the switchblade at the beginning, I'm like, oh great, like that's a nice little callback to like her, especially in The Last of Us 2, having the, unbreakable clicker knife finally moving away from like breakable shivs. I was like, great. Like that's a good little touch. And like a scavenging sequence where it like you'd never look for like Tampax in the game because you couldn't build a bomb out of it or whatever. But like, what would people actually be fucking looking for? Like that's great. And like combing every little corner, getting into the basement, even like this whole thing felt like one of the series of survivor notes from a specific area that they just like exploded upon that. And that was like one of my favorite parts about these games is like hunting for those and just getting the little pieces of like, what are the us doing? Like you said a minute ago, EJ, of like all this stuff is happening and it's not interesting in a video game to get a 50-minute Bill and Frank short film. But you can do that on television, and you can do it in a way that, as you said, Nick, like thematically resonates with the whole point of the show, which is making the difficult choices, which is how do you recover after everything's been taken from you? Is it possible to have a life that is beautiful in the face of all of this ugliness? Like having a garden, it's like, well, we're gonna have garden parties now, and then they have a garden party, like, and they can. Like, it's entirely possible to do that. Like, I don't know. I mean, it did
We're gonna
so
make
much.
friends.
Yeah, we're gonna have some.
There's not friends to be had out there.
I appreciated how the dichotomy between Bill and Frank, as sort of, Frank being the one that, everything's been taken away from this guy. He's presumably lost family, and he was even in the QZ, wherever he said he was, and
Baltimore, I think.
yeah, Baltimore, and things obviously went down over there. So your mind goes like, what exactly happened? And he stumbles upon Bill, and for him, he sees this opportunity to like, oh my God, I can like rebuild some sort of life. And then Bill, the guy who he didn't lose anything when the world went under. He gained everything in a way.
He only gained, right?
He was prepped for this.
I wasn't afraid until you got here, which, holy shit, what a fucking line that is. And like, how true is that for all of us who have partners, right? Or like, you feel so much, like such a great sense of security, but that also breeds such like a sense of potential fear where it's like, oh, like if this doesn't go, like that's going to hurt like a son of a bitch. Like I'm afraid now. Cause yeah, he could have lived forever and fucking ever by himself in that little town.
And I like how that parallels Joel, initially with Tess, and we obviously see that at the end with this letter, and Bill is saying, use this and take care of Tess. That's what we're meant to do. And of course, that's a whole other conversation about how Joel probably sees himself as his failure. He couldn't save his daughter. He couldn't save Tess. But the parallel between like Joel, the guy who lost everything, and Ellie, she was born into this, like she doesn't really know any better. So she obviously still has this naivete about her the same way that Bill kind of does. So seeing that dichotomy echoed in both sets of characters, I think is pretty interesting. I saw a lot of hand wringing online about, obviously you always have the dorks who get mad about all the details because they just want to be mad, like that they saw two men making love, and that just triggered the shit out of them. But like they were complaining about like, oh, Bill just went out shooting, the doomsday prepper shooting with no cover, and then suddenly this healthy guy got sick, and it was just like, gasoline wouldn't store that long, even with some sort of stabilizer, and just like all these dumb things to be mad at the episode because they just want to be unhappy about it. And while, like I said earlier, I think there's merit to like maybe taking a bird's eye view and saying, was leaving our main characters for an hour like the best choice? Like maybe not, but in a vacuum, the episode was just so goddamn good that you're not really thinking about that when you're done watching it.
And I think they did intersperse enough because it wasn't like 50 uncut minutes of Bill and Frank. Like you get the intro with Joel and Ellie, you get a little bit of flashback sequence of the start with Bill because of them walking by the death camp, basically, of people getting murdered and dumped on the side of the road. And that was like the transition into the past. And then you get more Joel because of him meeting with Bill and Frank with Tess. So it wasn't like you weren't getting any sort of character development because you get a lot of strong character development for Joel in particular. I thought maybe the only part of this episode that I think didn't really service any of the characters was Ellie with the infected in the cellar. I don't know what that was trying to show. Was that just showing Ellie being a little freako? Like,
yeah, think about it. Going back to the first episode, the look she gives Joel when he beats he murders the military officer, the way she's always asking for a gun. And then, seeing her, this morbid curiosity. And it's like, it almost could have been read as like exactly that, this curiosity. Was it this moment of humanity where she was like putting this thing that was a person out of its misery? Or was it this kind of disturbing, like, I'm going to kill this thing? Like, she's a little bit of a fucking sociopath, as all kids
it reminds
are.
me of like stepping on a fish that's like stranded on the shore, like it's not close enough to a living being that you can actually relate to, but it's still like a weird, disturbing kind of act. Like,
right.
She didn't look like she was sad about doing it. She was just like, I'm going to do this.
Yeah, I don't know what to
And
make
I don't
of
know.
it.
I don't know what that's establishing yet, because maybe there'll be payoff for that later, and they've shown that they're willing to set things up in one episode and pay him off in another. So I'm not worried about that. It was just like isolated. Everything else in this episode was like chef's kiss, and that was just like a weird thing.
Yeah, I wonder. It makes me wonder. I don't know. All kinds of stuff came to mind. It was like, oh, this is like a control thing that you've been controlled for most of your life in the canon of like the show and some of the timeline of like her and Fedra and everything. Which it feels a little different than it was, but maybe I'm remembering incorrectly.
Yeah, like a sense of agency because of her just being passed along as being this payoff and not actually having, choices.
And having come through like the two clickers in the historical museum in downtown Boston, where she was completely at the mercy of like Joel and Tess saving her, or she was going to fucking die. And she was the one who alerted them in the first place. And then here's this thing that's crushed. It even had like the half flowered skull that it was sort of like on its way towards clicker status. And it's like, who's in control now, motherfucker kind of thing. I hope it's seeding the garden for Chekhov's gun, as you called it. And like, is she going to pop off at a bad time with that thing and it's going to cause problems? I don't know. But it did make me kind of go, what's going on here?
It's twofold. It's threading the needle, showing her personality. And at first I thought it was just supposed to be to juxtapose Joel's daughter and sort of the innocence she had and the fear with Ellie and her sort of lack of reluctance. I don't know if found endearing was the right way to describe it, but the way she was fascinated by Joel killing the military officer. Everything they've shown about Ellie is they have to set her up to be competent to some degree, because we know that, when we get to winter and Joel is going to be injured, and it has to be believable that she's like literally capable of doing anything as a 14-year-old girl, but also of the right like mindset. And it's not necessarily cold and dispassionate, but that's why I think it was this morbid curiosity. To survive in this world, you have to make these matter-of-fact decisions, and you have to be a little bit cold and like willing to do the difficult thing. And so I don't think it was strictly like, oh, I'm a little sociopath, even though she's shown some of those tendencies. I think it's less about her just being like a fucked up little freak, like you said, and more, this is just the hard reality of like a really fucked up situation. And they're showing that she is able to both handle it and is curious about this darker side of survival that she probably hasn't had to confront, even at 14 years old. Like, when she saw Joel kill that guy, it was like, whoa, this is what it's like.
I'm really glad that we talked about this, because this is now clicking into place in my head about they can do so much with this if they pay it off right, with Ellie learning what it means to love, and that is protecting the ones you love with violence. And just look at the rest of both the games.
I was just fucking thinking that, like, Nick, get the fuck out of my head. Like, I was just going, what they can do that, again, the first game can't, because they didn't know that there was gonna be a second game. The cynic in me was like, yeah, you always knew, but also I'm kind of inclined to believe that they were like, we're gonna wait till we have the right script, like the right like plot treatment. You know what I mean? Anyway, that they can breadcrumb us in the direction of where she goes in the second season. And it's greenlit. It is now officially greenlit. It is fucking happening. Which means that we're going to have to reopen the conversation about what in the fuck are they going to do with that thing.
I don't want to litigate that too much, because they'll do what they'll do. And
I don't, we've litigated it plenty. I think at the end of the first season, maybe we'll have a better sense of it and we could chat about it again. But I think we made like our thoughts on that clear. I don't want to do that every fucking episode, because God knows it's just going to be chasing ourselves in circles forever.
I need something to yell about.
Yell about a career performance from Nick Offerman. Yell about like literally the best fucking work he's ever done, at least as far as I know. Like yell about the best actor in a featured role in a limited series, Nick Offerman. Yell about like all the fucking Emmys this show's gonna win. It's gonna win like 1 billion Emmys next year.
For real.
It's gonna be it's the moment. Like, it is the moment we thought it was.
I can't remember if it was Craig Mazin or Neil Druckmann who said this on the podcast for episode 3, but they said something that disturbed me, and it had nothing to do with this particular episode in its presentation. But they said, well, if we had done the story we had adapted it more faithfully, it would have been boring. And that concerns me, not because I'm disappointed they didn't do like, oh, Joel getting hung up in Bill's trap and the bloater and like Bill saving them. Like what we got was awesome. It concerns me because I think that was a really silly excuse to give. Like at its core, it's like, oh, Craig Mazin wanted to do his own thing. He wanted to change it. And he pitched it well enough to like convince everybody else involved to change it. But to just be like, oh, it would have been boring if we had done this. I'm like, no, it would have been another awesome fucking set piece. I'm glad that we got the reprieve from 2 pretty intense episodes, but it does lead me to think like, all right, what's in store for the rest of this show? We just got done last week talking about how faithful this is despite its changes. All the changes have been for the better. How faithful it is. Neil Druckmann, he's so close to it, he wouldn't let his baby, be massacred, kind of thing. And now I'm like, this maybe Craig Mazin kind of wants to change some things, and who knows what else is lurking around the corner as far as changes. And despite this one having worked out splendidly, it definitely reeked more of, well, I wanted to change it because I wanted to put my mark on this show. Which is a little concerning.
Like you said, like you need to have that reprieve to make the set piece moments matter. And you can't just have every episode be bombast. And having a bloater seems like that wouldn't really fit in a TV show that's trying to have the emotional connection that this one's trying to have.
No, for sure.
So I could see there not being any sort of boss fights in this show. Like the closest we're gonna get is the cannibal thing.
Yeah.
Right. And it's
probably.
And there is something to be said about like in a game, they can put you in the same scenario over and over and over because that's the game. Every chapter, more or less, is the same thing.
But we're not going to have another dark hallway, like a dark building with a bunch of clickers. Like we've done that. That was episode 2.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. Obviously, they could have adapted this in any number of ways. It was just the way he said it. Hey, man. You could just say, like, we wanted to do something different and thought this was more compelling. You could have just said
something
that.
more appropriate for television, like with the pacing, the vision that we had.
You didn't have to disparage the original.
It's a bit cynical.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like D&D talking about Game of Thrones and saying, oh, well, Daenerys just kind of forgot that blah, blah, blah. That makes you seem like you're incompetent.
Yes.
And that you are willfully ignorant and that you do not give a shit about your viewers.
I don't know if I'm reading quite the same thing from that comment is quoted. I do know that they're on record as saying like the show's not just going to be like a nonstop stream of violence because I don't think that's well. What would be the point of adapting this game only for it to be that? Because like the purpose of a game is for the gameplay to move you into the narrative section, so you're doing gameplay most of the time. And the purpose of a TV show is narrative to move you towards like emotional impact and or catharsis or however the fuck viewers are going to feel about the end of this season. Like, I think people who don't know the story are not ready. Like, I have to bite my tongue a lot around Tiffany, where I'm just like, you have no clue where this is going. But to the quote specifically, kind of sounds to me like the treatment that Neil Druckmann wrote up would have been boring. And that Craig said, okay, so we don't want to just do the section, and you've kind of mocked something up that's like, oh, they get there and they like pal around with Bill and maybe Frank's there and he gives them the car battery, and that he took that and extrapolated it into something that would be all of the things that we have said that this episode is, and that's where they landed on. Because if it weren't for having the Chernobyl folks attached to this, and there's other people they could have had attached to this, but if it weren't for having them attached to this, and like Neil Druckmann was like the showrunner, like the sole showrunner, I would have a lot less faith in this project for a lot of reasons. So I wonder if that's what's going on, is that they're like, yeah, here's kind of what I'm thinking, Craig, this is, as you said, this is my baby. And he was sort of like, nope, that's not that interesting. I'm going to turn that up to 11 and turn it into something.
Here's a 10-minute scene of Joel finding notes that Frank wrote about his tragic suicide.
No, I know. Yeah. And I can only imagine.
Here's Ellie finding some porn instead of some Tampax.
Right. Ugh. So there are 2 things I want to touch on before we wrap up. And one of them is let's go back to when we were still with Joel and Ellie, and they are rummaging around the what is that, an old gas station?
Gas station, Quick Mart, something like that.
and we talked about it last episode, but it's just awesome how they're able to take the essence of those experiences from the game and really compress those into these little moments. You do the Leonardo DiCaprio meme when you're pointing at the TV and you're like, I know that, but they don't overstay their welcome. They don't linger too much on it. Even to like the bit where she finds the Mortal Kombat arcade machine, which is obviously literally a moment from the game, but you know, it's so tied to her character. Like she's finding the comic books and the trading cards and like, you know, these relics of the past.
I thought she was running for a comic book for sure. And then the camera flipped
right.
and it's like, oh, it's the Mortal Kombat machine, which also is setting up Garrett, like totally bottle episode number 2 with Left Behind.
Right.
But you're right. It's like it comes and then we're out of it. It's like, this is a cache. I can't quite remember. It's been a couple years, which is fucking funny watching him like fuck about trying to see which shelf he needs to move. Meanwhile, Ellie's like, found a hidden room all by herself and like found some Tampax and took care of that infected that was in the cellar, like had this whole ass adventure. And then we're just done and it's gone. Like we don't need to see them like turning the whole fucking place over for parts and rusty scissors and electrical tape.
It makes me wonder what more we're going to get. Off the top of my head, I mean, I couldn't even speculate, but like what aspects of the game have we not experienced in the show yet?
Palette swimming.
Pepper in. Well, yeah, we talked about that.
It's going to happen.
There hasn't been any human enemies yet, and that was pretty much the start of that around this time. Yeah, I mean, I didn't watch. I don't like watching the next time on and like the behind the scenes stuff. I always turn it off as soon as the credits start, so I don't really want to spoil myself on that.
Okay,
but I mean, just pacing wise, I mean, as soon as the episode ended, Lindsay looked at me. She's like, "So next week is going to be like shit hitting the fan because this episode is way too." Like bittersweet and nice.
Oh yeah.
And I was like, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they had a laugh around deodorant in this episode. We're not going to come out bloodless in the next one.
No.
It's going to be exactly what we all think it is, right? Like the end of the fall section.
Like Ravagers and the truck getting jumped and that kind of stuff, I would assume. I don't know if there's going to be a tank sequence.
Well, probably not, but like specifically though, like the end of like Joel falling and landing on the pipe, and that's pretty much where we like end.
Is this going to be a 12 episode season or is it going to be 9? I thought it was like 9 episodes. 12.
I thought it was 12, but I could be wrong about that.
Pretty sure it's 12. Maybe they'll do that in 2 episodes, but I feel like winter's going to be at least 2 episodes.
I don't think we're gonna see a grave injury to Joel next episode. That maybe more like an episode 5 thing. But I guess it depends on, you know, are we gonna get another bottle episode like this or 2? Because, you know, how are they gonna tell the Left Behind stuff? Yeah, it seems maybe a little too early for that. I think we have more. We need to establish more of Joel and Ellie. You know, Ellie obviously, spoiler alert, when Joel gets hurt, she would otherwise at this point really have no impetus to stick around. She would go into, you know, survival mode and be like, he's fucked. So we need to establish them a little bit more.
I think there's at least 2 episodes before he gets hurt, because we've got like the hotel, we've got, you know, Ellie getting her gun and that being like allowed, that being encouraged, that like giving her agency and that establishing their relationship, I think will be the important sort of the impetus, like you said, EJ.
Yeah, you're right. We're only just barely starting to see that, like the look that they shared in the truck when they were hitting the open road, and like her moving the mirror, which I was like, this is such a specific like thing. This had to have come from the game, and I don't know. I can't prove that, but it just felt like such a thing that would be in a cutscene in The Last of Us. So bravo if it's not, because they fucking nailed it.
I have expected her to whip out a bad joke book.
I found interesting, they told this little anecdote about how the original intro to every episode was going to be like an open window.
Like the game.
Exactly. It's exactly it. And then, so I guess they had filmed a lot of these sequences of these open windows. So we got it at the end of this episode.
Thank you for mentioning that, by the way, because I would have forgotten, and I thought that like the push back into the window and then the focus coming into the drapes was such a nice fucking touch for that reason. Just a little tip of the cap to like a key piece of iconography.
Didn't even make that connection until you mentioned it.
Just to sort of wrap up the episode on like, we obviously know they're in that bedroom and they sort of got this happy ending that a lot of people aren't getting in this new world, and sort of seeing the truck drive off into the literal sunset and pulling back and sort of ending on their part of the story. It was beautiful. Something I took away from those characters, Bill and Frank, was I always read through all the time skips, I read this relationship from Bill's naive perspective. I was in his shoes the whole episode, and Frank was sort of the outsider. And I was always a little defensive, even up to the very end when they're old and he's sick, and the way he says, give me one more good day, cook the meal I want, do these things the way I want you to. And obviously from his perspective, it's like, he's like, this is my last day on earth. Like, you do this for me. But God, it felt a little selfish to me, which is how I always kind of viewed Frank in this situation, not considering how this was going to leave Bill. He was leaving him alone and leaving him to mourn and grieve. And I was just defensive for Bill. We think of these things conventionally as like black and white, right? And they got their happy ending and they were in love. And I think it's more complicated than that, whether intentional or otherwise, much more representative of the show, like finding some kind of happiness in a very, very dark time. And it's not so black and white. They were able to tune out all the evil of the world and lived happily ever after. Like, there were these strings attached and there were these things that sort of weighed down, their relationship and how they existed in this world. And I had to kind of sit with it for a little bit. There are no happy endings. Nothing's perfect.
Objectively, this is very romantic, as Frank put it.
Romeo and Romeo, as Lindsay put it.
I don't know. Am I reading too much into the thing that like Frank kind of felt a little manipulative to the very end?
Maybe a little bit, but to your point, it's illustrative of their relationship not being perfect because there is no such thing as a perfect relationship. Like, Frank has flaws, Bill has flaws. Bill has very surface level sort of prepper flaws, but Frank is also outward to a fault. Like, talking to strange people on the radio and inviting them into their compound is objectively not a smart or safe thing to do. And Bill reasonably gets upset with him about that. But they even mentions it like in that final scene where he says, I haven't always had only good days with you. Like, I've had my share of bad days and I just want one more good day. And from Frank's perspective, the way I read it was, I'm going to die and you're going to live on because you're still alive. But from Bill's perspective, there was nothing else to live for. Like, they had their run, they had as much good days as he wanted to have, and he was done. So he didn't want to live with, like, his main fear was Frank dying, and that was coming true. And that scene of him, coming to realization, like waking up and like, God damn it, why you got yourself up? You're not going to stay awake for this day. He's like, yeah, I'm going to stay up for this day. Like, that was a really powerful and strong scene, and getting just a sweet little montage of them hanging out and having another date night. And the waterworks, shooting off. It got really blurry for a while there. I don't know why.
You had a smudge filter on. Looked like
a David Lynch movie.
sobbing. And I like I go through these like stages every time. And like Tiffany always can like sense when the first one starts. Cause like my chest starts shaking, like my shoulders start shaking. And she like put her hand on my leg. She always puts her on my leg. I put my hand on her hand. And then that went to like some silent tears start coming. And then I fucking couldn't hold it back anymore. And he's like putting the ring on his finger. And I just like got literally like choked out sobs, was like vocally
why'd
crying.
they wait so long to get married if they had rings in a boutique?
I know. God. I was like, oh, they must have like jacked that out of somebody's like drawer in the neighborhood that they just like went through and were like, well, I never thought we'd need these, but
yeah, that or Bill like smelted them.
Yeah, right. Like, he just like melted down a bunch of like, I don't know.
This is one of those moments where I think my experience was hurt by my expectations of the game. So even through all these emotional things, and it was emotional, and yeah, you get a little misty, and being defensive of Bill, but also like expecting like, okay, well, Bill survives this and Joel comes back and they meet again. And it's obviously going to be quite different than the game. I did not expect them to, suicide together. And so the whole time I'm sort of removed from really fully experiencing these emotional moments because I'm anticipating what should be happening, or, wait, where are they going with this? It's different. How are they going to...
you let your top brain get in the way.
I still enjoyed the episode. I mean, I texted you right after we watched it, Chris. I was like,
you did.
I know you're in bed, but goddamn.
Yeah, and I waited till today. I was too tired, but I didn't even address your point, and I'm sorry for that. I think that you're right. I think that Tiffany literally did not trust Frank at all. Like the whole first, and she's the more impartial party because I'm like, oh, I know that they're like an item. And she was like, this guy's fucking fishy. This guy's so fucking fishy. And then she like eased off a little. And then when he like went for the piano, she was like, this guy's working an angle. He's working a fucking angle.
Of course he is. He doesn't want to be sent off back into the woods after being in this safe compound and being fed steak and wine. He doesn't want to leave.
And then we grow to love him, but for a lot of reasons that make him like a dangerous, frankly, like person to have around in a post-apocalyptic compound, like talking to fucking strangers on the radio. And like the things that he's advocating for make sense.
Using our resources to restore these dilapidated buildings. Yeah.
Like it makes sense in some ways, but it doesn't make sense in context of the show other than let me love it how it needs to be loved, which is fucking gorgeous. And like the softening and the development of Bill as a character instead of like the trap guy and now I give you the car battery. It's the same thing I thought with Tess, where I was like, they're making them 3-dimensional people, and Bill does change through the course of it, that he softens. Joel knows the gate code. He can write in shorthand in the letter like it's just the gate code backwards, knowing that no one else would know what that means. So like he's got the like a key to his house. Like it's unheard of for this guy as we know him in the game, but now he's a person. And the anticipation of, I literally, as we're getting down to the end of it and he's like pouring the wine, I'm like, this is amazing. We're getting 2 episodes of Bill. Like, I'm so glad we're getting like more Nick Offerman. And I like literally I am a horse with blinders on when I'm like riding the sled of a particularly like good episode of TV where like I'm just going to go where it takes me, and then pulling the rug like that on me. It's like, motherfucker.
They reversed me, because when Frank tells Bill the plan and then they have the dinner and he brings the glasses out and the topper's off the bottle already, I was like, oh yeah, the pills are in there. Like he's going to suicide the both of them. And I knew it. And then when he pulls the pills out of the thing, I was like, they got me. Bill's not going to kill himself. Well, of course he's not, because he has to meet Joel again. So I went through that roller coaster of like, oh, you think you're being clever? He's going to fucking kill himself. And then being like, just kidding. I'm like, that would have been interesting. And then he still does it anyway. And I was like, you got me again. Like it was just.
Talk about subtle playing with expectations, because I think we're on that same path where, yeah, Joel meets Bill. That's the story. That's in the game. They haven't diverged much from the game in that aspect. And this is just this is a different backstory for Bill and Frank. Like, it's not the Frank absconding, and then whether it's because he knows that he's infected and doesn't want to hurt Bill or whatever, but they wanted to just have a different story for Bill to be a more 3-dimensional character.
And they still get the truck with a message to be the motherfucker that will keep everybody safe. And like watching like just such a small, like a micro expression on Pedro Pascal's face, and like super close up when he's reading that. And he just squeezes in just a tiny bit of like, maybe I can still be the protector to someone, even though I fucked it up twice. And then he's like, all right, we're doing this. You're listening to me, but we're doing this.
Yeah. And he's still having that internal battle, because the first thing he does when he goes back inside is like, here's what's going on with my brother. This is why I'm going. This is like my intention. This is my motivation. And then Ellie digs a little more and asks questions. And then Joel says, no, this is not, I'm not bearing my soul to you. I'm just telling you my motivations. But there is that he gave way a little bit. He's opening up and using Bill and Frank as that sort of thesis statement of Bill being this closed off person and having nothing to live for, but living in spite of the world. Like his lifestyle is out of spite. And Frank being this maybe smooth talking, maybe a little bit shady, but in the end, just another person. Like he's just a person who just wants to survive. And part of survival is not just living and eating, but it's also finding people around you. And Frank showing Bill that aspect of it, and that sort of dichotomy of their wishes and their whims is just like a really sweet embodiment of Joel and Ellie, and that just reflects perfectly on them.
And also, he's got nobody now. Literally just occurred to me that like the people that Joel knows, the list is now Tommy. Like everybody else is gone. They even took like Bill, this sort of friendish, more smuggling colleague than anything.
Right. This like weird kooky guy.
Yeah, and he shows up expecting to be like, okay, we'll hopefully they'll be able to help us out, and fucking they're gone too. Like they have steadily whittled every single person away down, and now the need to go get Tommy, besides the fact that he's blood, he's it. Like blood family or otherwise, like that is all he has now. It's crazy. I didn't even think about it.
I think another bottle episode could potentially be, or maybe not even like a full episode, but just like we'll probably get backstory on Joel and Tommy at like throughout the infection and throughout them, like Tommy joining the Fireflies and they're sort of falling out because that's spoke of in the game, but I don't know if they really show it too explicitly. I don't really remember too much, but they can show it explicitly because show don't tell.
Yeah, I hope we get an episode. I didn't think about that. Just of Tommy and his experience.
Because Tommy ruled in the first episode. Like I thought that performance was like really good of them being brothers.
Yeah. Yeah, that'll be really interesting. And obviously, like later in the game, like we meet Tommy and he's like making this new life at this other compound, which is where, Joel and Ellie end up after the events of Last of Us 1. But again, spoilers, for the end of The Last of Us. But when I beat that game, I was really feeling pretty ambivalent. I did not know. And part of it was because I missed some context that I later, I discovered that kind of changed how I felt. But Joel gets Ellie to the destination and he comes to realize that they're going to kill her to like harvest whatever it is potentially about her fucking brain that makes her resistant to this fungus. And he is grown so attached to her and has this love for her, and he just cannot. And I know the game kind of gives you this. It's not really a choice. The game still ends up the same no matter what choice you make. But you either choose to go along with it and say like this is what she wanted, and like how this is the answer for humanity, or you say fuck this and you absolutely waste everybody. And the game forces you to waste everybody anyway and save Ellie. But at the end of that, I was like, man. Joel is kind of a selfish dick. And that again, this is a story about humanity. People are complicated and people make bad choices for the people they love if it means keeping them safe and servicing, their own desires. But I don't anticipate feeling that way leaving the show. I'm going to be so much more attached to these characters in a way that even at the end of the game, I was like, Joel, I know she was going to die, dude, but like, the vaccine, man. We come to learn in the game that like Ellie was not the first immune person they have tried to do this operation on, and it basically resulted in nothing but a bunch of dead people. And so it helps you rationalize in your brain as the player a little bit more to be like, well, of course we don't want Ellie to die if it's not going to save humanity,
which I think is a cop out.
I agree.
I seriously doubt that that's the way it's going to roll in the show. That it's like,
right.
Well, we've tried it before, but this one might work. Absolutely not. Like this is like
right.
they're going to frame this, I think, very, very much like this is it. Like we're going to take her brain out. We're going to make a fucking cure.
Really leave the audience with that choice. But again, we're going to be so attached to the characters. It's got to be like Daenerys in season 8. It doesn't matter how seeded her heel turn was.
Or Walter White throughout all of Breaking Bad.
Right, exactly. They broadcasted Walter White and exactly who he was from the fucking first episode. And they did it so goddamn well. And yet, most of us sat there rooting for that son of a bitch almost until the very end. And on subsequent rewatches, you're just like, fuck this guy every which way the whole time. Yeah, and maybe that context of a rewatch, will change how we view certain characters, but we're going to be so attached to Pedro Pascal by the end of this that we're like, do whatever you got to do, Poppy,
Build the stoke, build the hype cycle. It gives you something to look forward to when I get late in the week. I'm like, oh my God, I get to watch another episode of this show.
I think it would have done a disservice to this episode if it was just part of the blur that you subjected yourself to when you inevitably sit down for 4 hours and watch 4 episodes of TV in a row until you start like dozing off or whatever. So I like the week to week just so you can actually sit down, be focused, take it in, digest it, and not just like shovel more into your face.
I'm just so hurt by expectation. And Chris, you and I have waxed about this at length. But I am just so sensitive to it. And I on one hand, I love being a part of the recap culture. I've got all my YouTubers that I watch. I've got all my bloggers that I read after every episode of TV. And it really kicked off during the pandemic when everybody was really collectively experiencing pop culture simultaneously, which we have not had really as adults. Early HBO days, Sopranos, things like that. And then it really took off with Breaking Bad. But by 2012, binge culture and just the way social media evolved, that there hasn't been a lot of these collective moments. And the pandemic really brought that back, where it was like from Tiger King to Michael Jordan to whatever it was, like everybody was experiencing the same thing. And I appreciate that. I like being a part of it. I also really hate when being a part of that builds these expectations that nothing can live up to. And it just leaves me being disappointed. And that, yeah, it's my fault in some way, but can't help how I am, So binging just helps me get around that. It's also hard to block out the noise when people, and this is totally different, but My Hero Academia season 5, people complained about how awful that season was. And I understand if you're watching it week to week, that's pretty rough. But when you watch 22 episodes back to back to back, you're like, that was a great season. I had awesome moments. Like, I love these characters. But yeah, going week to week, it's just a different experience. And after 10 years of binging everything that I consume, yeah, it's just hard to adjust to that and fully appreciate things as they should be. Is there anything else y'all want to touch on before we skedaddle, Nick?
Yeah, no, you guys want to start working on ordering our list?
Nope.
Yeah, I'm not ready for it.
Show fucking don't. Tomorrow we can dip our toes in and start working on this. If we could get through like 25 games, I'd count that as a win.
Oh, so episode 100, the next episode, we've already recorded part 1. It is going to be Console Crusade's top 100 games of all time. We spent, we were sitting, I think, together for 6 hours the other night, but the podcast, part 1's about 2.5 hours of us just adding games to the list. Not even ranking them, just getting games out there that we all kind of agreed on. We went through our cuts. So we have our list of 100. This is going to be a monumental task. Guys, I'm not that worried about trying to rank them. I think we just need to be loosey. Let's just start at the top. Like, let's just put like 5 contenders for number 1. What do we all collectively agree could be number 1? And then just start randomly throwing things around and just, like Mega Man X obviously has to be above Plock. And then you just kind of start figuring in between, and you start looking and you just bounce back and forth.
That sounds like absolute hell.
Yeah, but that's the only way we're going to get it done without it taking 8 hours and just screaming at each other.
I think we need to build the tension by going
100 to
bottom
1.
up.
Yeah.
But in chunks, I think we can get the first 50, but like 51 through 100, I think we can knock that out pretty quick.
I think so.
Because we're not going to be too picky about like, oh, is this 61 or is this 62? It's just like, oh, is Plock better than NBA Street Volume 2 or whatever?
Right.
Yeah.
Like, it's going to be those conversations and having like fun little banter about the games and what they mean to us. But then it'll start getting a little bit more heated once we're talking about, is Super Mario Bros. 3 better than Super Mario World, right?
Yeah, there will be some interesting conversations there.
I swear to God, I'm taking a flyer on a lot of stuff that like I got my bitching and moaning done in the listing of things. Like, I made my fucking Odyssey comment. If you fuckers try and put that in the top 10, I will quit this podcast. But
come on.
Nick's like, oh.
We'll be litigating this in the future, so we don't have to be blowing our load on it right now.
But I'm not like putting Mario Odyssey in my like bot tier just because I don't like it, because I know that that's not conducive to where it's going to be ranked with 2 other voices that enjoyed it a lot. And same thing with Wind Waker. I'm like, all right, I've got a couple Zelda games on the list. Like, where do I feel this sits? And like, that's a really quality franchise. So like, what does that mean? And
I don't think anyone's going to be happy with the top.
Hopefully we'll all be equally unhappy.
That's exactly it.
I'm already happy with the 100. I think it's a good 100.
Hey, we never talked about the Whammy League. Do we want to like save that for later kind of thing?
yeah,
Episode
we'll
101.
I'm done.
Console Crusade.